A 14-year-old boy was handcuffed, humiliated, and thrown into the system for a crime he didn't commit. But when he stepped into that courtroom, he did something no one expected. He turned the entire case upside down. Zion Whitaker wasn't in a rush. The walk to school was familiar, a 15-minute stretch past cracked sidewalks and weathered storefronts. It was early, the sun barely cutting through the grey, overcast sky. His backpack, slung over one shoulder, felt heavier than usual. Maybe because of the upcoming debate competition, or maybe because of the history test he'd been studying for all night. Either way, today was just another day, until it wasn't. A sharp blast of sirens snapped him out of his thoughts. Up ahead, flashing red and blue lights painted the pavement, bouncing off the glass windows of a corner hardware store. Zion slowed his pace, adjusting his hoodie as he glanced at the commotion. A broken window. Yellow tape going up. An officer talking to a store owner. Then, he heard the voice. "You! Hands where I can see them!" Zion barely had time to process before a cop was charging toward him, hand already resting on his holster. Sergeant Roy Kincaid. The name was familiar. People in the neighborhood knew him, not for protecting, for harassing. Zion's hands shot up instinctively, heart hammering. "What's going on?" His voice was steady, but the question hung in the air like a challenge. Kincaid didn't answer. He grabbed Zion's wrist, yanking it behind his back with a force that sent pain shooting up his shoulder. The other hand followed, locked in cold steel. The cuffs were too tight. "We got him," Kincaid barked into his radio. "Got who?" Zion's voice cracked as reality started sinking in. "Don't play dumb," Kincaid muttered. "Security footage puts you near the store when it got hit. You matched the description." Zion's mind raced. The description. What description? He had just been walking. He hadn't even been near the store. "Sir, I didn't do anything," Kincaid scoffed. "That so?" Dark hoodie, sneakers, young, black, and there it was. A small crowd had started to gather. People slowed their cars. Some pulled out their phones, but no one stepped forward. Zion's heart pounded as the officer shoved him toward the squad car. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But as the cold door slammed behind him and the realization sank in, Zion knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. But the nightmare was only beginning. The squad car smelled like sweat and old leather. Zion sat stiff, wrists still locked behind him, every small movement making the cuffs bite deeper into his skin. He wanted to scream, to tell them to check the cameras, to actually look at the footage. But he knew better. The ride to the station was short, but it felt like a lifetime. The officer up front, one he didn't recognize, barely spoke. When they pulled up, Zion was yanked out of the car, his backpack left behind. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The room was cold. The kind of cold that didn't just seep into your skin. It sat in your bones. The first thing they took was his name, then his fingerprints, then his shoelaces, like he was some criminal about to throw his life away. A cop with tired eyes sat him in a metal chair. "Your mom's been called." His voice was flat, like this was just another formality, just another kid getting processed. Zion swallowed the lump in his throat. His mum. Lorraine Whitaker. Single mother. Worked 2 jobs. The hardest working woman he knew. The one person he couldn't stand to see worried. Minutes dragged. Then an hour. Then another. And then, finally, the heavy door swung open and Lorraine rushed in like a storm. Her eyes locked onto Zion's, searching him, checking for any sign of harm. But when she turned to the officer, her voice was pure fire. "Where is his lawyer? What is he even being charged with?" Sergeant Kincaid stepped into the room, arms crossed, his badge practically shining under the lights. "We have surveillance footage that places him near the crime scene. A store was broken into, stolen tools, damage. He fits the suspect's description." Lorraine's nostrils flared. "And that description is dark hoodie, sneakers." Zion watched as his mother clenched her jaw, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "My son was walking to school. Kincaid shrugged. That's what you say. The rage in Lorraine's eyes could have burned through the walls. But rage wasn't going to free Zion. A man in a wrinkled suit finally walked in, flipping through a folder like he had just skimmed Zion's case for the first time in the hallway. The public defender. He barely looked at Zion. They're offering a plea deal. Lorraine's head snapped toward him. A what? The lawyer exhaled, clearly exhausted. If he pleads guilty, he can avoid a trial, probation, community service. It's the best option. Zion's stomach dropped. Best option? Plead guilty for something he didn't do? Just like that? His mother's voice was steel. We're not signing anything. The lawyer sighed like he had heard this all before. I understand, Ms. Whitaker, but these cases don't usually go well. It's his word against a police officer's. A trial could mean no. Lorraine cut him off. Zion's fingers curled into fists. His mother was right. They weren't just going to accept this. But what scared him wasn't just the system working against him. It was the way everyone in the room had already decided his fate. But Zion wasn't about to let them decide his future for him. Zion barely slept that night. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment from the police station. The handcuffs. The way Kincaid smirked when he talked to his mother. The public defender pushing that plea deal like it was the only way out. He wasn't a lawyer. He was just a kid. But even he knew something was wrong. By morning, his decision was made. If nobody else was going to fight for him, he'd fight for himself. At school, he skipped lunch and went straight to the library. The legal section wasn't big, mostly outdated textbooks and reference materials, but it was all he had. He grabbed a thick book titled Criminal Procedure and flipped through the pages, scanning for anything that could help him understand his situation. He started with the basics. Burden of proof. The prosecution had to prove he was guilty, not the other way around. Chain of evidence. If the police didn't handle evidence properly, it could be thrown out. Witness credibility. A cop's word carried weight, but inconsistencies could tear their testimony apart. The more he read, the clearer things became. They had nothing on him. No fingerprints, no stolen goods, just a grainy video of someone in a hoodie. And that's when it hit him. How tall was the suspect? Zion wasn't exactly tall for his age, 5'4" on a good day. What if the person in the video was taller? What if he could prove the person wasn't him? He grabbed another book. Cross-examination techniques. That's when the librarian, Mr. Langford, a greying man with thick glasses, walked over. What's all this? He asked, glancing at the stack of books. Just researching. Langford gave him a long look. You in trouble, kid? Zion hesitated. He could lie. Say it was for a project, but something about the old man's gaze made him sigh. Yeah. Langford pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Then you'd better know what you're doing. For the next hour, Zion explained everything. How he was accused, the plea deal, the lack of evidence. Langford listened, nodding occasionally. Then he leaned back. You got good instincts. But court isn't just facts. It's how you present them. Zion nodded, taking notes as Langford broke down the basics of courtroom strategy. How to make a jury see the truth. How to plant doubt. How to ask the right questions. By the time he left the library, Zion's notebook was full of ideas. He wasn't just hoping for justice anymore. He was preparing for battle. But the real test was coming, and the courtroom wouldn't be as forgiving as a library. The courtroom smelled like old wood and coffee. Zion sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together, his heartbeat a steady drum in his chest. His public defender, the same man who barely looked at him in the station, sat beside him, flipping through his notes like he hadn't even read them. Across the room, Sergeant Roy Kincaid sat stiffly in his uniform, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but Zion could see it. The confidence, the certainty. This wasn't a man who thought he'd lose. The judge entered, an older man with silver hair and deep lines on his face. The moment the trial started, Zion felt it. The weight of expectation. The prosecutor stood first. A woman in a navy blue suit with a voice as sharp as a razor. She didn't waste time. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The defendant was seen near the crime scene, matching the description given in the footage. Sergeant Kincaid, a veteran officer with over 20 years of experience, detained him based on probable cause. We believe the case speaks for itself. Zion gritted his teeth. Probable cause. Those two words had stolen days of his life. The prosecutor turned, walking toward the jury. This case isn't complicated. The store was broken into. Stolen goods were taken. And who was seen nearby? The defendant, the hoodie, the sneakers, the time. It all adds up. She made it sound so clean, so obvious. Zion's fingers curled into fists. Then the public defender stood. Zion had no idea what he was about to say, but he wasn't hopeful. The lawyer adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and muttered, "My client maintains his innocence. We intend to show that the evidence does not conclusively prove he committed this crime." That was it. That was the best he could do. Zion closed his eyes for half a second, forcing down the frustration. He had prepared for this. He wasn't going to sit there and watch himself be thrown under the bus. Then the judge turned to him. "Mr. Whitaker, I understand you wish to speak on your own behalf." Zion took a breath. His mother was in the back, watching, holding her breath. He stood. The courtroom quieted. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was steady. "I do." The judge studied him. "Proceed." Zion stepped forward, glancing at the jury. He had one shot. "Let's talk about the evidence," he said. "Or the lack of it." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Zion pointed at the prosecutor's table. "The security footage. Where is it?" The prosecutor shifted, then nodded toward a screen. "We were just about to present it." The video played. A grainy figure, in a hoodie, moving fast. The store's window already shattered. The person's face completely hidden. Zion folded his arms. "That's it." The prosecutor frowned. "That is you." Zion shook his head. "No, it's not." Silence. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, may I ask a question?" The judge nodded. Zion looked at Sergeant Kincaid. "Officer, how tall am I?" Kincaid blinked. The question caught him off guard. I don't know. 5'4"? Zion pointed at the screen. "Then tell me why the store's security camera logs say the suspect is 5'9". A pause. A heavy pause. The prosecutor shifted. Kincaid's jaw tightened. Zion's pulse pounded, but this was just the beginning. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that held weight. Zion stood his ground, his heart hammering in his chest. But he didn't let it show. He had just exposed a massive hole in their case. The suspect in the video was 5'9". Zion was 5'4", and now every single person in that room knew it. The judge leaned forward. "Prosecutor, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "The footage quality is poor. It's difficult to make an exact measurement." Zion shook his head. "Not according to the store's security system." He turned toward the jury, his voice steady. "Most modern cameras have a height scale at the entrance. It's designed to measure people during a robbery. The footage they're showing you, that height marker is right there. The suspect walks past it." Kincaid shifted in his seat. He knew. He had to know. The prosecutor sighed. "Even if the height isn't exact, the hoodie and sneakers match. That still places you at the scene." Zion didn't flinch. He was ready for this. "With all due respect, that's not how evidence works." He turned back to Kincaid. "Officer, did you check my shoes when you arrested me?" Kincaid's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. "Of course." Zion nodded. "And were they the same shoes the suspect was wearing?" Kincaid hesitated. Just for a second. But everyone caught it. The prosecutor cleared her throat. "We don't have to prove every detail." Zion cut in. "Yes, you do." Another ripple of murmurs. Zion wasn't a lawyer, but he had studied. "The law says you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And right now there's doubt all over this case." The judge turned to the prosecution. "Do you have any direct evidence linking the defendant to the crime?" The prosecutor hesitated. The officer believed, Zion repeated. His voice didn't shake. He locked eyes with Kincaid. That's not evidence. That's a guess. And guesses ruin lives. The room was tense. Then Zion took a slow breath and stepped forward. Your Honor, may I submit something to the court? The judge nodded. Zion pulled a folded paper from his pocket and walked toward the clerk. This is a record of Sergeant Kincaid's disciplinary reports. The prosecutor's eyes snapped up. The judge raised an eyebrow. And where did you obtain this? Zion kept his expression calm. It's public record. The judge took a moment, flipping through the pages. The tension in the room shifted. Finally he looked up. Sergeant Kincaid, is it true that you've had multiple complaints filed against you for wrongful arrests? Kincaid's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched. That's irrelevant. Zion turned to the jury. Is it? Because I think it matters. I think it matters that the officer accusing me of a crime has been caught doing this before. The prosecutor looked ready to object, but the judge held up a hand. Zion felt it. The shift. The doubt. For the first time since this nightmare started. He was winning. But the biggest revelation was still coming. The courtroom felt different now. The air had changed. The confidence on the prosecution's side had cracked. The jury was no longer looking at Zion like a suspect. They were looking at him like a kid who had been wronged. Sergeant Kincaid was visibly tense. His usual air of authority had been stripped away. Zion could see it, the small shifts in his posture, the tight grip on his wrist, the way he avoided eye contact. And then the judge spoke. We will take a brief recess before the jury deliberates. He glanced toward Kincaid. And I want a word with the prosecution in my chambers. That was never a good sign. Zion sat back down, breathing carefully. His mother reached forward from the row behind him, squeezing his shoulder. You were brilliant, she whispered, but he wasn't celebrating yet. 20 minutes later, everyone was back in place. The jury filed in. The bailiff called the courtroom to order. The foreman stood. This was it. The judge nodded. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman cleared his throat. We have, Your Honor. He looked straight at Zion. On the charge of burglary, we find the defendant, Zion Whitaker, not guilty. A rush of relief flooded Zion's chest. Lorraine exhaled sharply behind him, her hands pressed together in silent prayer. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned to the prosecutor. After reviewing the evidence and the new information presented, I am instructing the district attorney's office to open an internal investigation into Sergeant Kincaid's conduct. A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. Kincaid's face turned red. Your Honor, this is absurd. I'd be very careful about what you say next, officer. The judge interrupted, his voice firm. Because this court has seen enough today to question whether you should be wearing that badge at all. Silence. Zion watched as Kincaid sat there, trapped, the same way he had been just days ago. But Zion wasn't the one in cuffs now. The judge cleared his throat. This trial is adjourned. The gavel came down. It was over. Zion turned, and before he could react, Lorraine wrapped him in a tight embrace. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. But even as relief washed over him, Zion knew this wasn't just about him anymore. Because if Kincaid had done this to him, how many others had been silenced? But Zion wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Outside the courthouse, the sky felt bigger, the air lighter. Zion had walked in as a defendant. Now he walked out free. But freedom felt different when you had to fight for it. Reporters gathered near the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Zion! How does it feel to prove your innocence? Someone called. He paused. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder, steadying him. He could have said a lot. That he felt relieved. That he felt angry. That he felt tired. Instead, he looked straight at the cameras. I shouldn't have had to prove my innocence. Silence. Then murmurs. People scribbling in notepads. The weight of those words settled. Because that was the truth. Zion hadn't just fought against a wrongful accusation. He had fought against a system designed to break people like him. And that system was still standing. Lorraine led him past the crowd, but before they reached the car, a voice called out, Hey, kid! Zion turned. It was Mr. Langford. the school librarian. He wasn't alone. A few of Zion's classmates stood beside him, even kids he didn't talk to much. "You did it," Langford said, nodding. "You made them listen." Zion swallowed. "Yeah, but what about the kids who don't get the chance?" Langford studied him, then smiled. "Then maybe it's your job to make sure they do." Those words sat with Zion, because it wasn't just about him. In the days that followed, Sergeant Kincaid's internal investigation became public. More stories surfaced, more names, other kids, other cases. Some had taken plea deals just to make it stop. Others had lost years of their lives. Zion had won his case. But the fight wasn't over. He wasn't done. 1 week later, he walked into the school library, a notebook under his arm. Langford looked up from his desk. "What's that?" he asked. Zion set the notebook down. "A list." Langford raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" Zion exhaled. "Every law I've been reading. Every right people need to know. Every trick they use to keep people quiet." He pushed the notebook forward. "I want to help people, kids like me, so this never happens again." Langford smiled. "Then you'd better get to work." Zion nodded, because he knew now. Justice doesn't come easy, but when you fight for it, you make it harder to ignore. And this fight was just beginning. If you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that subscribe button. More people need to hear stories like this.